What's up, metal and heavy music fans? It's Flight of Icarus again with MetalTrenches.com, and today I'm going to rank the albums from Swedish progressive groove death metal band Meshuggah. But before I do that, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and stick around afterwards because there's plenty more content, including other tier ranking lists, album reviews, album rundowns, retrospectives, and the podcast, of course. So don't go anywhere. But yeah, let's just get right into it, and we're going to start with 1991 with Contradictions Collapse. And Meshuggah's an interesting band too, because I think unlike any other band that I have done a list for at this point, they have stuck with the same label their entire career. So they've been on Nuclear Blast since this album. It was actually a long time before I came back and checked this particular one out. I actually got my start with Destroy, Erase, Improve, and kind of circled back many years later. And I got to say, I was pleasantly surprised. My expectations were pretty low. I was kind of expecting this to be kind of rocky, but ultimately, it's a really solid album. I think the best way I've heard it described is it's kind of like an extension of Metallica's And Justice for All or Master of Puppets. I can definitely hear that, especially like Jen's vocals on this album. He's kind of putting more of like a Hetfield yowl, kind of like a yeah kind of thing into it. And that plus the riffs are definitely kind of prog era Metallica. Um, I I think taken just as its own, I would probably give this album like a B if I was just scoring it, if I was reviewing it. But taken within the larger scheme and context of the band's discography, I feel like a C feels more appropriate just because with all the albums that are to come and the much increased quality from this one, that feels right to me. So let's move right along though to Destroy, Erase, Improve in 1995. And for me, this was it. This was like the big daddy. This was my initial exposure to the band. My friends and I had been downloading songs based on bands we had come across in metal magazines, and I stumbled onto the track Future Breed Machine, and I have been a fan ever since. I remember sitting in awestruck silence just listening to that track, and it continues to be one of my favorites from them to this day. I finally got to see them play it live too, which was amazing. It felt like kind of a religious experience, things coming full circle, but I digress. This is where the band kind of started to actually sort of develop their own sound. It feels like they're kind of coming into their own with that trademark kind of gent guitar tone and style, and mixing that with kind of these jazzy interludes. Also, just a couple of little factoids here. This album is number 42 on Rolling Stone's 50 Greatest Prog Rock Albums of All Time and 77th on their list of 100 Greatest Metal Albums of All Time. So needless to say, it's popular and for a good reason. The first three tracks to me are like excellent, maybe even perfection, but it does kind of start to lose some steam for me after Transfixion. There's longer jazz parts like Acid Placidity that make for a more dynamic listen, but ultimately the pacing's a little bit clunky, and it does start to kind of feel like it drags in certain areas. So, even though I kind of want to rank it higher for legacy, again, when weighed against everything else, I was kind of bouncing between a B and a C. I think ultimately I'm kind of leaning more towards a B these days, and so I think I'm going to put it there, even though it doesn't feel right to have these on the same level. So I'm going to go ahead and put that at a B and move on to 1998's Chaosphere. This is a much beloved album of the hardcore Meshuggah fan base for good reason. It's got the mainstay track New Millennium Cyanide Christ, which is a commonly played live track. Really great stuff. This is a much faster, heavier album than Destroy, Erase, Improve. I feel like it's kind of more to the point, fewer interludes, more kind of just in your face, really fast with Concatenation. One of my favorites. At this point, fully embracing the polyrhythmic gent style as the core element of their sound. And this is kind of the first album that really, from here on out, this is kind of like the blueprint for the rest of their albums almost, I would say. Another album I had to cycle back to as well, because even though I was initially exposed to Meshuggah with Destroy, Erase, Improve, I heard that album when Nothing was coming out. And so I basically heard the albums from Nothing forwards and just happened to also hear Destroy, Erase, Improve. But I really kicked myself when I did finally come back to it, because damn, is this a good album. And I was lucky actually, because I just happened across the CD at a like discount store for like $1. And I was like, well, hell, I can't say no to that. And I popped it in, and goddamn, is this an amazing, amazing album. The first half in particular is pretty much perfection. You got just all these raging, pummeling tracks like Corridor of Chameleons, and then the groovier Neurotica. And the second half's really solid too, with tracks like Sane. But that first half especially just kicks your ass. And I also like the weird vocals on The Exquisite Machinery. I will say this album feels a little overly uniform compared to some of my more favorite albums. Like there's just like a lot of sameness between the tracks that I like on later albums is a little bit more differentiated. So for that, it's not quite an S tier for me, but it's definitely an A at minimum. This is a fantastic album and a must listen one for the band. So let's get into 2002 with Nothing. And for all intents and purposes, this is my mainstay Meshuggah album, because again, this is the one that was coming out when I was exposed to the band. Absolutely love it. Like I said, it was like coming out when I discovered them. I remember there were ads everywhere in the magazines I was reading, hyping it up with the album art, and they had the tagline, "You'll get nothing and like it," which I always thought was funny and kind of clever, and it just really stuck with me. And so, let's just say it for what it is. This is clearly an S tier Meshuggah album for me. For my money, it's also one of their most dynamic and varied albums. It has a lot of different kind of textures and layers to it, while never straying too far from their core sound. I definitely hear some interesting influence too of the nu metal movement, which was also going on around this time, more so on like the atmosphere and the production than the songwriting itself. But same thing that was kind of happening to other bands like Fear Factory around that time. Everybody was kind of figuring out like, oh, this is the big thing, so how do we kind of capitalize on this? But ultimately really leaning into kind of the slower, groovier elements of the band, abandoning most of the kind of thrash influences from the past. At this point, this is where it becomes kind of like head bobbing music as opposed to straight up like head banging music. It was also remastered in 2006 with 8-string guitars, and I like both versions. Obviously, the 8-string version has a lot more low end, but either version is perfectly enjoyable. I've probably spent about equal time with both of them. So many incredible songs on this album: Rational Gaze, Spasm, Closed Eye Visuals, and I actually used Stenga in a college music course during the unit on time signatures. We were supposed to bring in tracks that were not in 4/4, and I gotta say I had the teacher a little bit stumped, because it's the drum is in 4/4, but with that polyrhythm, the guitar kind of rolls over past it each time. And I've never been great at describing it. I'm not really like a music major or a big time like technical person, so somebody more into that stuff could explain it better. But yeah, it took the music teacher a few listens to kind of start figuring it out. If I do have one criticism of this album, it's that it is a bit overlong at nearly an hour, and you could honestly probably snip off the last 2 tracks, so a little bit more sort of atmospheric. They're not bad. It just, I feel like it would be more concise that way. But either way, I could listen to this album over and over again, and I do. And I think for all of those reasons, it is worthy of the S tier. Now, I didn't make this particular tier list, and so they included the EP I, which is kind of interesting because there are other EPs that aren't on here. But in any case, I'm kind of glad it's here because this came out in 2004. I was pretty hyped for this when it was coming because it had been a while since I'd gotten some Meshuggah. It had been 2 years. And I was excited to hear that they had this EP, and it was like this 21-minute track. And that was not something I had a lot of experience with at that point. I had listened to some Opeth, but that was kind of my extent of like listening to longer metal compositions at that point. But it's a really solid EP. In fact, I feel like it really manages to carry the length with great pacing and some raw intensity, great riffs. Really not a dull moment on this one. And so I would rank it as a B. It's really good stuff. And I like it better as sort of a primer to 2005's Catch 33, because I've got a lot of stuff to say about Catch 33. Some of it you listening out there may not particularly like, but I just got to say this continues to be one of the, if not the most divisive album in the band's discography, and it seems to be about 50-50 with the fans. Like half of the people seem to think it's a masterpiece, maybe even among their favorite albums from the band. The other half, and to just avoid kind of burying the lead here, the half that I fall into, just don't particularly like this album. This is my least favorite Meshuggah album. I used to say I hate this album. That's not really true. I went back and re-listened to all of these in just a marathon in order. And, re-listening to it now, I don't hate it, but it's still by far like my least favorite of the album. To be fair, I might give it more of a C. And also, again, like I was saying with the debut, if I was just reviewing that album just as its own thing, it's definitely not a D. It's probably even more of a B. Because there's a lot of really solid performances on here. It's pretty, it's got some moments, and I like the experimentation. It's got some innovation to it. But within the context of their discography, like, this is the album I would choose to listen to the least. So D or C, depending on how you want to look at it. But yeah, it's not terrible. And it's just that, in a vacuum with the other albums, it just doesn't stack up for me. And the Cardinal Sin really is kind of a simple one. It's just boring. I find it to be really, really dull. The pacing isn't there. Like I said with like, they've got this long composition, and they maintain that with really solid pacing, and everything's kind of consistent and engaging. Whereas they did kind of the same thing here, because it's just one long song just broken up into 13 movements. But ultimately, it's not as good. There's a lot of time on here that I consider to be kind of dead time. And it's also the first album with fully programmed drums, with the drum kit from Hell. And I think that kind of turned me off too. And I think that may be part of the issue with this album, because it feels very soulless and robotic to me. And I think that that's at least in part due to Hake's absence here in terms of like an actual live performance, and just not very catchy. There aren't a lot of like standout moments really. Every time I listen to it, I kind of walk away from it being like, I don't remember anything that I just listened to. Like, I literally had to take notes on the stuff that I did like. And, Entrapment's all right, and the first two parts of In Death are pretty fun, but beyond that, it's a cool idea. It's fitting for the band as a concept in theory, but in execution, it just doesn't keep me coming back. But let's move on to 2008 with Obzen. Another fantastic album, one that I would consider to be one of their best. I love Combustion. It really kicks off the album with that bass intro. Always reminds me of it's a very Tool sounding riff, which makes sense because they were actually touring together around that time. And it just grabs you by the throat, and is just an excellent way to kick off this album. That and, of course, Bleed, which are both, I'd say, maybe in their top 5 songs of all time. And seeing them perform Bleed live, too, they almost brought down the damn house at the venue I was watching it. That legendary riff, and just a track that one simply doesn't skip when it comes up. Amazing stuff, and just stuff of legends, really. This was also kind of a return to, I feel like, their faster paced material, because both Nothing and Catch 33 had that kind of slower, groovier pace, and Catch 33 had a lot of those kind of interludes and everything. This is more like raw, in your face, fast, kind of more bringing back some of the kind of the thrashier elements, but ultimately just really intense stuff. I would say it's not quite as consistent for me as some of their other top albums, but it's definitely up there with tracks like Obzen and Provis. A little bit of trivia too. The title is a combination of obscene and zen, and it's supposed to be a play on the idea that kind of as a society we've developed this zen with the obscene things out there. And so yeah, obscene. All around, just a really great outing, and often named as a top choice among fans for me personally because it's not quite as consistent as like my top ultimate favorites. I'd say it's about an A. There's not really a bad album on here, but there are like I feel like it has those really top tier, amazing best of the band's career tracks, and then kind of some they're okay kind of tracks that are a little bit more middle of the road, a little more average. But now we're going to go to 2012 with Koloss. I fucking love Koloss. I fucking love this album. For my money, it's their best album. And I have just no question about that, which is interesting because I have yet to hear anyone else say that. When I ask people their favorite Meshuggah albums, without fail, it's Nothing, Obzen, or Chaosphere. Almost every single time. There are a few outliers there, but I've never heard anyone say Koloss is their favorite album, and I don't understand why, because cover to cover, every song in this album could be a single. It has this level of consistency that's unmatched by any other of their albums, and much like Nothing, you again kind of get this variety in terms of paces and textures to really mix things up. You've got the lumbering menace of I Am Colossus. You've got the groove machine of Do Not Look Down, the maniacal tapping of The Demon's Name is Surveillance, the frantic sliding on Marrow, and the mega gent mosh pit anthem Demi-Urge. Like, a lot of my favorite like mainstay playlist songs from this band are on this album, and it is another one that I could just listen to on repeat over and over and over again. There's really, it's like, what's not to love? This is a great album. I feel like it deserves more recognition, and it barely feels its length too, because it's another one that's nearly an hour long. But I was actually surprised when I was reminded of that, and I was looking at the details, because it does not feel like an hour. It breezes by. And just to include an actual quote that I thought stood out from Thomas Hake on this one, he said, "As always, we try to take our music in a slightly different direction with each album, and with Koloss, we feel we really nailed what we were going for. Organic brutality, viscera, and groove all crammed into a 54-minute metalicious treat, best avoided by the faint of heart." I concur. It is S tier without question. And then wrapping things up, we've got our final album here. So far, I believe I've heard that they are working on a new one. And speaking of which, Violent Sleep of Reason came out in 2016, and that was just shocking to me because I'm like, it's already been 4 years since this came out. I feel like it just came out like a year or two ago. But anyways, it was interesting looking back at the details of this album because I didn't know it was recorded live too. Like they recorded this one live as a band all together instead of recording their separate parts and kind of copy pasting them together. And that's pretty impressive. Just in its own right. And especially within that context, I gotta say, I just don't understand the opinions I hear about this album. From when it came out to today, I still consistently hear a lot of... I feel like more people have come around and have started to say they really like this album, but I feel like there are more people that are still like, no, man, like it's not that good. It's not as good as their other albums. They even go so far as to describe it as dumbed down is a phrase I'll hear a lot. And to that, I just say, are you high? Like, I don't understand that. And especially, again, having marathon these albums in a row over the course of one day and heard this one again within the context of everything that came before it, I'm just not hearing it. Do you not hear some of these solos, some of these drum parts? And again, add on to that this is recorded live. All of them together, having to have all of these polyrhythms and kind of technical elements come together perfectly. Otherwise, they got to redo it. They got to redo it over and over again if any one of them makes a mistake. Yeah, this album, it's every bit as good as the ones that came before, in my opinion. It's loaded with more great additions to their pantheon of classic songs. You got Clockworks, Born in Dissonance, Monstrosity, however you want to pronounce that. Nice little double entendre there. Nonstrum. I caught quite a few of these when I saw them live, and they were even better performed on stage. There's really not a bad song on here either. All killer, no filler, as they say. Kind of like Obzen. It's got some of like the higher tier ones mixed with some of the kind of like just solid tracks, but honestly, and I'm gonna get some flack for this, I would say it may even be a little bit more consistent than Obzen. But in any case, it's impressive, and it's especially impressive too because these tracks average like 5.5 to 6 minutes each, and once more, fill up just seconds short of an hour, but it ends up being engaging pretty much the entire time. So to the naysayers out there, you got to re-listen to this album. It's fine if it's not your favorite, but for those of you who are out there saying that this is like a bad Meshuggah album, I implore you, I challenge you to try it again and see if your opinion changes at all. It's not as good as Koloss, not as good as nothing, but still worthy of an A for sure. I think it is on the same tier as these. But yeah, great stuff. And stick around because there's a lot more content that if you enjoyed this, you will probably enjoy them as well. But now, this is Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.